Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Clayton Sinyai, and I am the Executive Director of the Catholic Labor Network. And I'm so glad so many people have joined us today for our program on Rerum Novarum. It's the 130th anniversary of this papal encyclical that set out the right of workers to organize and the right of workers to a living wage as part of Catholic social teaching. I like to point out that that means the Catholic Church recognized these rights almost 50 years before the United States recognized these rights in the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act. The Catholic Labor Network, I should mention, has been around for about 25 years. We bring together workers, our Catholic Union activists, both rank and file workers and officers and staff, with clergy, religious, and lay social justice advocates who promote Catholic social teaching on labor and work. And I want to thank the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which has supported us with a grant that enables us to put on programs like this. So without further ado, I will hand the reins over to our primary presenter today, Professor Jerry Beyer of Villanova University. Professor Beyer, take it away.
Thank you very much, Clayton. It is my pleasure to be here with everyone this afternoon. I'm delighted to be here to celebrate the 130th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. As you know, Pope Leo XIII's landmark encyclical became the cornerstone of modern Catholic social teaching's defense of workers' rights, and I'll speak about it in due course. But first, I want to say something about the deeper historical roots of Catholic social teaching that led to Rerum Novarum. And in doing so, I want to acknowledge my debt here to the work of my friend and scholar Joe Holland, as well as many other scholars who have traced this history of Catholic social teaching, which really spawned Rerum Novarum. Catholic social teaching ultimately finds its roots in the Bible. In the words of the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, quote, "By means of her social doctrine, the Church takes on the task of proclaiming what the Lord has entrusted to her. She makes the message of the freedom and redemption wrought by Christ, the gospel of the kingdom, present in human history," end quote. To put that another way, Catholic social teaching serves as a tool of evangelization by helping us to translate Bible values and principles to specific historical, economic, social, and political circumstances. It helps Catholics and others to understand how to, quote, "see, judge, and act." This is the method that Cardinal Cardine used with the young Christian workers in the 1920s, which was later adopted by Pope John XXIII in Mater Magistra. The Catholic social tradition traverses the whole of Christian history. However, the tumultuous experience of the modern era, marked by liberalism, the Industrial Revolution, social dislocations, new forms of exploitation wrought by capitalism, the rise of atheism, anti-religious sentiment, and communist ideologies, prompted Catholics to read the signs of the times in the light of the gospel with a new urgency. The first stage of industrial capitalism began around the middle of the 18th century. In 1740, Pope Benedict XIV published the first modern papal encyclical, Ubi Primum. Between 1740 and Pope Leo XIII's pontificate, the popes produced 77 more encyclicals. According to Catholic theologian Michael Schuck, the pre-Leonine popes devoted significant attention to, quote, "immoral business practices, such as exorbitant profits from sales, fraud, Sunday labor, usury, and theft," end quote. Already in 1800, Pius VII issues the first condemnation of the, quote, "enemies of private property." The popes of this era critiqued cultural and political liberalism, decried the decline of traditional agrarian life, and commended solicitude of the poor. They did not yet develop a sustained critique of early local capitalism per se. However, social Catholicism was beginning to bloom in several parts of Europe. Social Catholicism constituted the, quote, "organized response by Catholic Christians to the harsh impact of capitalist industrialization upon the working class," end quote. The new social question they confronted in the 19th century was the quote, difficulty of reconciling the interests of the new classes of industrial bourgeoisie and their clientele on the one side with those of industrial workers on the other, end quote. The brutal working conditions these brutal working conditions particularly plagued women and children of the working masses who needed to work night and day in order to survive. The towering figure of social Catholicism in Germany was Father Wilhelm Emanuel von Kettler. He stood against his contemporaries who contended that the gospel only grounded personal ethics by demonstrating by demonstrating its relevance to the social question. To the dismay of many Catholics who were content with the status quo, Kettler began in 1848, the same year the Communist Manifesto appeared, to speak publicly about the necessity of the Roman Catholic Church responding to the plight of workers. At the First General Assembly of Catholics in Germany, he decried the immense inequalities of wealth and vastly increasing property. As Archbishop of Mainz, he criticized both capitalism and socialism for failing to respect the dignity of workers and promoted concrete remedies to diminish the evils of the Industrial Revolution in a speech to the German bishops in 1869. And he enumerated among these evils abolition of child labor, limits to the workday of factory workers, separation of men and women in the workplace, elimination of unsafe workplaces, no work on Sundays, care for temporary or permanently disabled workers, and state inspection of factories. So those were the remedies to the evils that he saw. His book, The Question of the Worker and Christendom, Die Arbeiterfrage und das Christentum in German, became a pivotal text in the Catholic social tradition. As Marvin Cryer Mitch observes, quote, the roots of Rerum Novarum are found in sermons and writings of this parish priest who spoke out and analyzed the poverty and subsistence wages of his community, end quote. In fact, decades later, Pope Leo XIII himself referred to Archbishop Kettler as, quote, our great predecessor. Across the Atlantic, Catholics also took up the cause of workers in the 19th century. Like in Europe, workers in the industrializing US endured harsh working conditions. They regularly faced 12-hour workdays, 6-day work weeks, no vacation or sick leave, and very hazardous working conditions with no health insurance. In 1833, the wealthy Irish immigrant Matthew Carey, who was a publisher and philanthropist, advocated for the dignity and rights of laborers, particularly women, in public speeches and writings. He insisted that all workers should be paid a living wage. Father Augustus Theobald, a pastor from Troy, New York, who later became the first Jesuit president of Fordham University, denounced the callousness of employers towards their downtrodden employees. Cardinal James Gibbons of Baltimore holds a unique place in this history. On his journey to Rome in 1887, Gibbons convinced Leo XIII to avoid condemning the Knights of Labor, the first major U.S. labor union. Uriah Stevens founded this powerful union in 1869 in my hometown of Philadelphia. The Knights grew to over 700,000 members in the 1800s under the leadership of Terence Powderly, a machinist and son of Irish Catholic immigrants. Although the Knights excluded Chinese laborers, Powderly advocated, quote, solidarity among skilled and unskilled workers, men and women, black and white, end quote, and guaranteed their inclusion, albeit on what he called separate and unequal terms. According to Powderly, Catholics comprised over half of the union's membership. Yet some members of the U.S. Catholic hierarchy did not approve of the Knights because they equated the union's call for wealth distribution with socialism and rejected the union's secrecy. The Canadian bishops actually condemned the Knights. However, the majority of the U.S. archbishops approved the union, with Gibbons and Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul staunchly supporting it. Believing that the impoverishment of workers necessitated the right to organize, Gibbons and other leaders persuaded Powderly to end the secret oath of the Knights. This paved the way for Rome's approval of the union. Gibbons and the others' efforts led to Rome not banning Catholics from joining the union and helped to impress upon Pope Leo XIII the need to address the plight of workers. They implored the Pope to issue an encyclical on the, quote, respective rights and obligations of both capital and labor, end quote. Gibbons echoed Cardinal Manning of England's claim that the church must align itself with the masses, not the aristocracy. Gibbons told the Pope that he was, quote, alarmed at the prospect of the church being presented as the friend of the powerful rich and the enemy of the helpless poor, end quote. The church had already lost many of its working class members to socialist movements in Europe. Gibbons opined that the American working class would also lose patience eventually without unequivocal support from the church. In short, and now I'm coming to Pope Leo's turn toward his own social Catholicism. In short, without the work of church officials, professional authors, academics, and grassroots leaders between 1740 and 1890, Rerum Novarum would never have happened, in the words of Catholic scholar theologian Michael Schuck. However, Leo XIII's own experiences caused him to have sympathy for the working masses as well. From 1843, he was the papal nuncio in Belgium. During his trips to England, Germany, and France, he especially witnessed industrial capitalism's forward march and its effect on workers. He was influenced by the Freiburg Union and Leon Harmel's worker pilgrimages to Rome in 1888. Cardinal Manning's expression of solidarity for the striking dock workers in London in 1889 also made an impression upon the future pope. In short, he came to believe that the church must provide a solution to the worker question and understood that the evangelization of the working class was necessary to stem further loss of workers to atheistic socialism. Leo had voiced concern for workers with increasing attention in earlier statements on other issues, but Rerum Novarum would become the Magna Carta of social Catholicism and papal social teaching. Today, I can merely highlight a few of Rerum Novarum's many enduring contributions. The encyclical begins by noting the signs of the times, among which Leo mentions the, quote, misery and wretchedness of the masses of the poor, and the, quote, callousness of employers and the greed of unrestrained competition, quote, rapacious usury, end quote, and the concentration of wealth and the means of production among a small group of rich people, creating a, quote, yoke little better than slavery itself, end quote. Leo defends the right to private property, condemning the flawed approach of socialists who deprive downtrodden workers of the right to own private property, a right which is, quote, preeminently in conformity with human nature, according to Pope Leo. We may note that later popes endorse but qualify the right to private property, thus hewing more closely to Thomas Aquinas' position. As St. John Paul II later stated, private property is circumscribed by a, quote, social mortgage, which means that the state can limit the right to private property if meeting the basic needs of all truly requires it. Pope Leo does mention Thomas's claim that the moral law requires people to share their possessions when others are in need. However, he does not, unlike future popes, admit of the state's right to redistribute property. Pope Leo sometimes cites scripture as a source of the church's social teaching. For example, he appeals to the book of James, chapter 5, verse 4, to ground the obligation of employers to pay workers what they rightly deserve. Leo also appeals to several other scriptural passages throughout the encyclical, but more often he grounds the rights of the human person in the law of nature, as he calls it. On the basis of natural law, human beings have rights to, quote, food and all necessities, end quote, for one's children, a just wage, and the right to form trade unions. Pope Leo saw unions as both natural and necessary. As he contended in Rerum Novarum, it is a, quote, natural impulse, end quote, for human beings to form communities in the workplace so they can pursue their God-given purpose together with others. This is the case because we are social beings made in the image and likeness of the Trinitarian God. It is part of the structure of what it means to be human. This leads to the conclusion that having a union is a right in accordance with natural law. Catholic social teaching holds that natural rights cannot be eliminated as they are a part of our God-given nature. In this way, unions are like, quote, the confraternities, societies, and religious orders which have arisen by the church's authority and the piety of Christian men, end quote, according to Pope Leo. So he compares unions to these other types of social organizations. In Pope Leo's view, unions are also necessary for protecting the dignity and rights of workers and their families, because capitalists who hold an imbalance of power over workers often do not give workers their just due. It is Pope Leo's recognition of the vulnerability of the poor workers and this imbalance of power between employers and employees that undergirds his support for the right of workers to form unions. In Rerum Novarum, Leo thus stated, quote, on the one side, there is the party which holds power because it holds wealth, which has in its grasp the whole of labor and trade, which manipulates for its own benefit and its own purposes all the sources of supply, and which is not without influence even in the administration of the Commonwealth. On the other side, there is the needy and powerless multitude, sick and sore in spirit and ever ready for disturbance, end quote. In Pope Leo's view, it is especially unions, which he calls the most important of all organizations working for the well-being of workers and their families, who can afford, quote, afford opportune aid to those who are in distress. The point that I just underscored in Pope Leo's Rerum Novarum about recognizing the imbalance of power is extremely important, because what's going on here in Pope Leo's thinking is an understanding that society, although he doesn't espouse a Marxist understanding of intractable class warfare, he does also acknowledge, on the other hand, that there is social conflict. There is conflict between labor and capital, and that unions are needed to redress that imbalance of power. Pope Leo chided capitalists who cruelly exploited their workers, treating them as, quote, mere instruments for making money. He argued that labor should not be so excessive as to cause deterioration of the worker's mind and body. In a time when employers generally did not respect the worker's right to life and limb, Leo insisted that the dignity of the worker requires doing what is possible to promote his or her health and safety. Children, argued Leo, should not be forced to toil prematurely because, quote, hard work blights the young promise of a child's powers, end quote, and precludes education. In short, Pope Leo believed that unions were necessary to protect workers and their dignity and rights because of the cruelty, this is a quote, cruelty of men of greed who use human beings as mere instruments for money making, end quote. Furthermore, Pope Leo maintained the state must protect the right to organize and the other rights of workers. If it does not, it, quote, contradicts the very principle of its own existence. The state must limit itself to the minimum needed to, quote, remedy the evil or remove the danger, end quote. Nonetheless, the state should enact laws to protect the rights of workers, ensuring that they have decent working conditions and wages, thereby obviating the need for strikes. Pope Leo also maintains that commutative and distributive justice require the state to promote, quote, the interests of the poor, end quote, and the working class. This includes the right to unionize. Thus, we have in Rerum Novarum, which stands on the shoulders of many figures in the modern Catholic social tradition, the basis for the unwavering support for the right to unionize in official Catholic social teaching up to the present moment. St. John Paul II echoed Pope Leo's words in his wonderful encyclical on human labor, Laborem Exercens, where he stated workers' unions are, quote, an indispensable element of social life, end quote, necessary for workers attempting to, quote, protect their just rights vis-a-vis the entrepreneurs and owners of the means of production, end quote. Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis have also strongly supported the rights of all workers to form unions, with Pope Francis going as far as saying, quote, there is no good society without a good union, end quote. The Holy Father likened unions that, quote, unmask the powerful who trample the rights of the most vulnerable workers, end quote, to the prophet Amos. On this day of remembering Rerum Novarum, may we hope and pray that all employers and governments recognize the vital need for workers' unions, including those Catholic employers who engage in the egregious and sinful behavior of union busting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Beyer. Now I would like to note that although frequently I hear the argument being made that the teaching in Rerum Novarum from 130 years ago was important then, but is not important now. Pope Benedict XVI, in his letter Caritas in Veritate, specifically rejected that idea. He said that that in these days of globalization, a global economy where workers are pitted against multinational corporations and where a number of countries have restricted the right to organize, he said the teachings of the church in Rerum Novarum must be upheld today even more than in the past. Well, for now we have a couple of speakers who are going to let us know whether that right is being protected even more than in the past. A couple of workers who have gone through organizing campaigns in modern America who can talk about the current state of the right to organize. The first one who will be presenting today will be Chuck Hendricks from the Catholic Labor Network. Chuck?
Thank you, Clayton. Thanks for having me. My name is Chuck Hendricks. Today, I am the bargaining director for Unite Here, which is the Union of Food Service, Hotel, and Casino Workers throughout North America. And I'm a parishioner at St. Vincent de Paul's Parish in Baltimore. What Clayton asked me to come today and do is explain a little bit about how union elections work under the current law in America, and also about what I experienced when I was, 21 years old, 20 years ago, and tried to organize my first union. And really, as we heard earlier, we need a balance of power in the current law. Really, there's a massive disparity in the balance of power between workers and labor under the labor law in the United States. So I'll just kind of try to walk through, this and my history. Bear with me for a minute. So we're doing here first is, looking at what a union election looks like under the Labor Relations Act of 1935. The first thing is kind of how is the process supposed to work? Many of you probably haven't been through a union election in your lifetimes, but the process is meant to be very simple under the law. If 30% of workers sign a card saying I wish to be represented by a union, they should sign those cards. Those cards would be presented to the National Labor Relations Board, which administers the National Labor Relations Act. The board would verify those signatures and call for an election. The NLRB would then have the company and the union, supposed to be equals here, work together to find a place and a time and a location to have an election. They would certify which types of people, right, should be in the voter pool, who the workers are that are supposed to be able to cast votes, and then a vote should be held expeditiously. If there's no fight between the two parties, an election can be held within 3 weeks. Very, very quick. People sign cards, they go through this process, they hold an election, they vote yay or nay. If a majority of those workers vote yes, you have a union. So the process is not meant to be very complicated. Sadly, that's not really how it works in the U.S. This is a picture of me from 1999. I'm the very young looking one, second to the right, when I worked at a company called Fuster Painting Company. This was in Baltimore, and I don't think we were that dissimilar from many types of jobs. At that time, at least many non-union jobs, if I wanted healthcare, I had to pay 50% of the cost. Wages were, $10 to $15 an hour for industrial and commercial painting. Mostly my business, the business I worked for, did work at Loyola University, Notre Dame, and Village Julie College in Baltimore, as well as some of the businesses downtown. There weren't really any safety standards. It was a low, small 60-person company. And because there was a lot of industrial commercial painting, we were laid off, roughly 4 months out of the year. And there was a ton of overtime required. So at this point in my life, I'm about 20 years old. I had just had my first daughter named Lexi. And, I was making $10.50 an hour, and I really couldn't afford, was about $800 a month for family healthcare. Not possible to afford. So I was frequently stressed out and worried. And at some point when she was about 6 months old, had to go to the emergency room twice in the course of about a month, leaving me with thousands of dollars in debt for those 2 emergency room visits. It was crazy time in my life. And ultimately, it was that experience of my daughter having to be go to the emergency room. She didn't get hospitalized, but going to the emergency room, being constantly broke and afraid for my daughter's, that she would get sick again, that led me to deciding to organize a union. I actually found a book called Organizing to Win that tells the story of how you're supposed to organize a union. And it lays out the process of the NLRB and says, get your coworkers to sign cards, take them to the NLRB, you'll have an election. So I followed what I was told to do and to organize the union. Got cards from the locals painters union, signed up the majority of my coworkers to have an election. We took them to the NLRB and thought that we would be able to get the process started to have an election, and we would have a union and be able to bargain better conditions for ourselves. Let's see how that worked out. So the first thing is, once you turn those cards in, you have to figure out the election. But in America, the parties are equal. However, they're equal in that they can disagree about when the election takes place. Where does the election take place? What happens if you can't agree what job should be in? What happens if you can't agree to which employees have which jobs? What happens if you can't agree where an election is conducted? Well, what happens in all those cases is you have to have litigation. And so the moment you file for that election, the employer has every right to object to every single one of these. And so in my case, we had to argue as a union of painters whether or not the boss's wife, who was the secretary, should be included in the union. We had to argue about whether the election should take place near our workplace at Loyola and Notre Dame, or if it should be held in the boss's office. We had to argue about if the election was going to be held in the middle of the day or on the weekends. And every step of this process drags out the process. And this dragging out of this election process gives the employer more and more time to carry out a campaign of fear, intimidation, coercion, all the things that would make people feel powerless and helpless and scared. And so this is what campaigns look like. What could have been a simple 3-week election took much longer and allowed the employer to have, put leaflets in every single one of our paychecks. So every week we got a paycheck, we had a leaflet telling us how horrible the union was and reminding us that the boss controls our paycheck. Once a month for 4 months, the owner of the company came and had a captive audience meeting on the clock with all of us where we couldn't speak out, and he would lecture us about how horrible the union was. I'll never really forget the first time that the boss came in and put up anti-union posters in a captive audience, and watching these middle-aged men that I worked with turn from macho guys who weren't scared of much to being very scared of their boss very quickly, as he told them that they should vote no. We had one-on-one meetings where the owner of the company came and met with us and, basically told us that he was the one that paid us, not the union. Very clear reminders. We had supervisors do anti-union petitions where the supervisors would go around and tell us we should sign these if we don't want to have the union around. And that every one of us knew that was just a loyalty oath. Were you with the boss or are you with the union? Because those petitions went back to him. We had threats, we had promises, and frankly, in my case, I was terminated towards the very end of the union campaign. I was fired as my boss sent me to go and work by myself at the Noxema factory up in, can't remember the name of the town, Hunt Valley. I was sent to go into the Noxema factory by myself to paint pipes day and night by myself. And then after a few weeks up there where I couldn't talk to any of my coworkers, was fired. That was right towards the end of the anti-union campaign, since I was the one leading it. And those things of the leaflets, the captive audience meetings, the one-on-ones, the anti-union petitions, the threats, the promises, the terminations, those are the norm, not the exception in American labor law. There was no way to fire your boss, but there's a big way for them to fire you. That's what we saw. Here's some examples of kind of the messaging. I saved these all from the 21 years ago. These were the leaflets that my employer, Robert H. Fuster Painting Company, put out at the time, right? Reminding people and saying that they should get the union to guarantee them a better job. that they should vote no on January 19th, that the employer is the one that pays you, that the union can make you go on strike, they can make you pay dues over and over and over again. And these were the leaflets that we received every week from the company. So you can kind of see that they can carry out this long campaign as they buy time by stalling the election. Now, some of those things are illegal, right? There are things under the National Labor Relations Board called unfair labor practices. And these are the ways that unions and employees can push back and say that you're breaking this law. If you're threatening us, you're breaking the law. If you're coercing us, you're breaking the law. If you're spying, or if you terminate us, you're breaking the law. And those are, all the things that I said and that me and my coworkers said at the time, but it still had the effect of pushing my coworkers to getting scared and becoming nervous about moving forward with the union. So ultimately, the companies is able to do a lot of things, and then we could file charges and say, don't do this. Here are the normal things that you can do that you can win from even a finding that they broke the law. You can't make people become unscared. What you can get the government to tell them to post a notice where they say, I will not break the law again. You can see here on the right-hand side, this was the one from my campaign 21 years ago. We will not interfere with the rights of people to join a union. We will not threaten our employees. We will not encourage. We will not prohibit. All the things that they had done for the last for the 6 months of the union campaign, they had agreed that they would not continue doing, but the damage is already done. And that's what we know about the labor relations law in the States, is that the employer does all of these things, and all that we can get really is, in some cases, you might get somebody returned back to work, but they've already lost 6 months of back pay. You can get a notice posted, but that doesn't change all of the threats and promises that were made. And so these are the punishments. You can see that they're very, very weak punishments. The law is toothless. So this is kind of the history. In my case, I was terminated. I eventually did get my job back, and we got this notice posted from the company, but you can see the date at the bottom. It was June 7th, 2000. The election was supposed to be held January 19th of 2020, and we turned our cards in of June of 2019. So filed our cards. 12 months later, we hadn't had an election. I was terminated. We went through a whole legal process and did not end up with the union. And that's the most normal kind of scenario you can see by following the labor law in the States. So that's my story.
All right. Thank you very much, Chuck, for your presentation. So we've heard a story about how it was 20 years ago trying to organize a union, and whether the rights laid out in Rerum Novarum were protected then. Now we're going to hear from another presenter who went through this process very recently, just in recent months. Michelle Burke, a nurse from Maine who organized in her hospital to form a union. The floor is yours. Please tell us what your experience was like.
Hello, everybody. My name is Michelle. As he said, I'm a nurse in the emergency department at Maine Medical Center. For those who aren't familiar with the healthcare in Maine, which I don't know why you would be if you're not from here, Maine Med is the largest hospital in the state. We are the only trauma center. We're the only neonatal intensive care unit. And really Maine Health as a whole, which Maine Medical Center is a part of, has become the largest employer in the entire state. We began trying to organize back in 2019. I was not a part of it then. I didn't quite know the whisper campaign that was happening, but COVID really brought more and more things to the surface and really made nurses realize that coming together to unionize would really not only benefit us as employers, but also our patients. So that unionizing effort really came to light in 2020 to me. and I became part of the organizing efforts then. It's quite eerie hearing Chuck's story from 21 years ago, because we experienced many of the same things just as recently as a few months ago. We officially filed in January of 2021 after filing cards and getting all those signatures. And we did not have a vote. It was a mail-in vote until end of March, and then ballots were not counted until April. So we went through a open busing campaign from January till April, but really they already brought in the busing law firms in November. So before we even knew what they were doing, or we thought we were getting away with something, they were already making plans to try to bust our unionizing effort. When I try to think of how to describe the busting efforts, the only thing that really comes to mind is that it is just a constant, ever-present fog of fear and intimidation. Any chance they can get, you are hearing about how your employer is great. The problems that you thought you had are not as bad as what they are. And really, a union would only cause more problems for you. And they never miss an opportunity to let us know that. We in the ER have daily shift huddles, and this was way before this. Every day we start our shift, we hear about plan for the day, staffing. These very quickly became the captive audience meetings that Chuck was describing. We would get started with hearing about the day, and our manager would stand up and say, "I just would like to clarify something with you," and then proceeded to give their biased opinion about something that we were trying to change or improve, or something that was a part of our campaign to unionize. So we were hearing that every morning. Night shift was hearing that every night. We began getting text messages to our personal cell phones. These things included links to YouTube videos where we were asked to give our leadership a chance. Let them try to work with you and fix the problems that are there. They began highlighting other nurses, trying to create a culture of arguing with your peers. These are people that don't want a union. Do you like them? Do you want to still work with them? They don't want it. Why would you put them in an uncomfortable position? Those things were sent to us, started off on a weekly basis. And as the campaign was drawing to an end, we would get them more regularly, about every other day. We were told to enroll in mandatory classes called Know Your Rights. This is something that every nurse had to go to. And in these classes, we were misled to believe that it was put on by the NLRB. Pamphlets that were handed out during the class were from NLRB's website. But luckily, we knew to ask certain questions, such as, who exactly are you employed by? We very quickly discovered that this was actually a company called Reliant. Their main objective is to bust unionizing campaigns. All of the content in the meeting was just about 1 degree left of the truth, just a little bit off, meant to distract or confuse or just sow a little bit of confusion. And many people left those meetings not quite sure if unions were for them until they really started asking questions and finding out information on their own. But if their job was to sow confusion, they were definitely successful in that. The campaign that was put forth by the hospital was both kind of broad strokes like these classes and the text messages, but also very personal, very nurse specific. Our management in our department began surveilling who were the main players, who was trying to organize, and they began putting them in isolating assignments, put them in a part of the department where they're by themselves. They won't be able to go and chat with people. They couldn't quite send us to another factory or another place offsite. We're all still there, but they could at least get us far enough away that you can't have those casual conversations and really get to the truth of what's going on. And that happened for months. We had a charge nurse in particular that was in these meetings where they were asked to isolate staff. And the quote that she walked away from with that meeting was management saying, "Well, I can't stop them from organizing, but I can make them miserable while they're here." This was in a closed door meeting, but as you get nurses who start to realize and open their eyes to what the hospital was doing, they began to want to tell the truth and see what was actually going on. The next layer was people began being pulled into the office. This is again another layer to make it really personal and make people question um, your peers' character. We were pulled in and told that our tactics were scary, intimidating, bullying, that people are quitting because of us organizing, which was not the case. But it was just enough to make you question, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Are we mean? Are we bullying? And it really took our organizers to help ground us and say, this is not bullying. You're fighting for the rights of yourself as a professional and your patients. And it took that constant thought to really ground us back down. We really were up against millions of dollars of anti-union busing efforts. Our hospital employed not only one, but two union busing groups. One was the Reliant, who put on the classes, but the other one was Jackson Lewis, who's a little more behind the scenes, that helped with kind of the broader busting. So us little lowly people really just working hard to pull nurses together. We're regularly reminded that we did not have the same force or power that the hospital did. These busing efforts did go on for months, as I said, from January till right about the end in April. They've so far kind of started to slow now that we officially won. Our vote ended up being 1,001 nurses voting for the union and 750 voting no. But we're still holding our breath, knowing that the fight is still going on to get a first contract, and knowing that they will probably try to pull a few more stunts while they can still do it. So it was a long campaign, but it was very inspiring to be a part of something that has been going on for years before me and will go on for years after as well.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle. It's been great hearing from you, and let me see if I can bring back all our presenters here. We now have time for some questions. Now, we've got a large group here today. So if you have questions for Professor Beyer or for Chuck or Michelle, feel free to type those into the chat, and we'll see if we can put those forth for people who want to find out more about exactly the origins of the right to organize in Catholic social teaching, or the experience today. I see a few people mentioning the PRO Act in the chat. I should mention, I should explain to those who are not aware, there's actually a major campaign in the legislature to try to reform labor law and bring it more into line with the principles of Rerum Novarum. It's called the PRO Act, or Protecting the Right to Organize Act. And it would end a lot of the, it would add serious punishments for employers who break the law by retaliating against workers exercising their legal rights. I see Lizzie Mack in the chat mentioning that when she first started at the hospital, she asked about unions and was told she'd be fired if she spoke out. And thanks, Michelle, for her comments. Professor Jerry, would you like to say anything to follow up after you heard from the two speakers speaking about labor law today in the US and how you think that connects with Catholic social teaching?
Obviously, we see the vast contrast between what the popes have taught over, well over 100 years about the rights of workers, particularly on the right to unionize, and what happens on the ground. And of course, this isn't just particular to the United States. We know about union busting going on throughout the entire world. It's in a way we could say it's endemic to neoliberal global capitalism, union busting. You know, in many countries, people trying to organize are not only threatened, they're killed. And so we in the Catholic community have a lot of work to do on multiple levels. And I'm grateful to Chuck and Michelle for doing the hardest work, you know, on the ground, trying to organize. Those of us who are not involved, who are Catholics, who are not involved in actively organizing, though, we do have, I think, our work cut out for us, because we have to evangelize the Catholic community and the broader community. Among Catholics themselves, there's data that shows Catholics are anti-union. Almost half of Catholics have anti-union opinions, you know, which clearly contradicts Catholic social teaching. And so, you know, there's a lot of work of education and evangelization to do among us, to teach our brothers and sisters who are Catholics that this is not sort of optional teaching that we can just say, well, you know, this stuff is, sometimes it's referred to as a prudential judgment. Well, no, actually the right to organize, the right to unionize is an unassailable human right, listed in Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council among the, you know, most sacred inalienable rights of the human person. In other words, to put it simply, this is very serious stuff in our teaching, our church's teaching, that we just can't say we don't like, or it's, as you said earlier, Clayton, something that is of a bygone era, because our current Pope has reminded us again and again, it's not. I'll just say one more thing about this. And you know, I've heard from many a priest that he didn't learn about Catholic social teaching on this issue at all in seminary. Right. And then I can speak about my own child who went through catechism classes. She's now a teenager and she's done, but, you know, never once heard about Catholic social teaching, let alone the right to unionize in Catholic social teaching. So, you know, unfortunately, this is a massive failure in the way our religious education, and in the training of priests as well. So there's just a lot of work to be done on a lot of different levels.
I have another question for you that will follow well on that one. John McNamara has asked about whether Catholic colleges are known for honoring the principles of Rerum Novarum. And I know you've just written a book about universities and social justice, Professor. Do you have any thoughts on Catholic colleges and colleges in general, and how they measure up to the social teaching of the church?
Do I ever? Yes, as you said, Clayton, I have just published a book called Just Universities, Catholic Social Teaching Confronts Corporatized Higher Education. And I'm sad to say that, Michelle, what you described in your workplace, and Chuck, what you described at your workplace, is going on Catholic campuses right now, and has been going on for quite some time. In the book, I name names. I talk about universities that have, you know, undergone active union busting campaigns. The letters, Chuck, that you posted, I point to similar letters that university administrators created at Catholic colleges and universities. So the playbook is being used, the same playbook that you both described, Michelle and Chuck, it's being used on some Catholic campuses. I could say a lot about this because, as you said, I've just written a book about it. So I don't want to say too much more. But I'll just say this. This is a massive failure of the mission of Catholic higher education. It's hypocrisy that flies in the faith of Catholic social teaching. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, our students notice it. Our students see it. And we all know that young people are leaving the church in droves. And we know from sociological studies, they're leaving because of hypocrisy. The disconnect they see between practices in the church, and we can talk about this practice of union busting or other practices that are going on in the church more broadly that contradict Catholic teaching. And so pedagogically, we're failing our students when we allow for union busting to go on our campuses. And in fact, we're really damaging their faith. This is an affront to their faith formation. So this, what I'm really saying here, and it's a scandal, and I use that term scandal in the strict theological sense. The Catholic tradition recognizes a notion of scandal, and it holds that when someone or an organization is engaging in a behavior that simply cannot be explained legitimately to the faithful, scandal can arise. So union busing on Catholic universities, campuses is a scandal in that technical sense of the term.
I should ask Chuck to weigh in here too, because I think he actually has some example. His union has actually had some experiences where Catholic colleges and universities took steps to protect the rights of some of their members on campuses. Is that correct, Chuck?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, there's a big disconnect between how Catholic universities have treated their faculty and how they've treated their service workers. I think at this point we have, and we certainly have over 30 Catholic universities where the food service workers on campus have unionized in the last 10 years. And the schools have been helpful in the process of getting these subcontracted companies to agree to a neutral process to unionization, as well as in many cases, you know, creating pathways to living wages for cafeteria workers on campus. You know, there are places where the only unionized food service workers in some states are on college campuses or Catholic colleges, like Texas. The only unionized food service workers there, or cafeteria workers, are in college campuses there. And that's I think that it's been a lot of work reaching out to them, but they clearly show a very clear disconnect when they're judging the actions of their subcontractors from when they're judging their own actions with their own staff. So.
Thank you. We have a question for Michelle here. The questioner, John Gutierrez, asks often the anti-union side tries to argue that unionization will hurt the hospital. Can you tell us something about how your union, how you were mentioning that you felt unionizing helps your patients? Can you elaborate on that?
Definitely. Our hospital certainly played that commentary of bringing a union in will add a third party or make communication between management and nurses more challenging. My kind of counter to that is, without having nurses' voices at the decision-making table, you miss out on a breadth of knowledge. And it goes from very small things, including ordering supplies in the department that's actually useful and helpful to the job that we do on a day-to-day basis, all the way up to staffing and budgets. We, especially with COVID, working with slimmer staff or really changing the way our department flows with different algorithms for staffing, it quickly became, ooh, we can do something different with less money or not have to spend quite as much for staffing, when it really took nurses stepping up to say, we cannot have 5 patients for one nurse. This does not equate to good, safe ratios. We cannot take care of patients in that way while maintaining the excellent level of care that we're expected to give and that we want to give. So from kind of big and small, respecting the voices of nurses and really that bedside perspective is so valuable. And we've already seen changes as we've really tried to put our best union foot forward and already work as a union. We've already made changes to end rotating shifts, which is linked to many health issues for nurses, kind of having standardized either day shift or night shift, as well as working on getting better staffing ratios.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and
I can make a
Oh.
comment. My name is Chuck Dom in Chicago. And I just recently gave a class at Mundelein Seminary, and it was part of their Catholic social teaching course, which was wonderful. And they got all this that you're talking about here today. They really did get a very good course. I read the syllabus and everything. I was there to talk about domestic violence and how the church has to address that issue. And I think one of the, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said here today, but I think one of the missing links is like these seminarians, I had 24 in this class, they learned all about this, the right to organize and what have you. But will they ever speak about it? Will they ever preach about it? And that goes like for domestic violence. Will they ever say anything? I know that Sojourners created 100 sermons on domestic violence, which you can find. So there's all kinds of examples of how you can preach about domestic violence. But I don't know if there exists some kind of resource about supporting the right to organize, right? Supporting unions, because I think a lot of priests, one, they think, well, the readings don't lend themselves, which is a bunch of baloney, or what would I say and why would I say it? So I think really they need a little bit more encouragement and direction in order to actually get this into the pulpit and out into the congregations.
thank you, Charles. Any thoughts on that, Professor Beyer, before we close for today?
Charles, it's a great point. I think it's a wonderful point, and I completely agree. It should be part of the formation of seminarians how to preach about these teachings. So I guess that's another piece that folks need to work on.
But it cuts across everything. I mean, we have wonderful church statements about immigration, but who preaches about it? Maybe priests who are in immigrant parishes, but outside of that, nobody talks about it. So we need to have that step, I think, to help people understand you can talk about this even if you're in, an upper class neighborhood or parish.
Well, thank you, Charles, and I thank everybody for coming to our program today. I invite you to join us for other Catholic Labor Network programs in the future. You have a good afternoon, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.